All right, next session, commercialization, finding a balance.
Hey, Kirk, if you're still there, you can drop out. Thank you so much for everything. Thanks for the support of the event.
Here we go, trying to get all my buttons pushed right. Commercialization, finding a balance, and thank you to our day one sponsor, Dynetics, and the Aerospace Corporation for sponsoring this session. I'd also like to thank Sir Richard Branson for giving us such a good lead-in for this session on commercialization. And we will soon have a follow-up from Blue Origin as a follow-up to this session. But I'd like to remind our audience that this is not a session on commercial launch. It's not a session on commercial spaceflight. Those are very small pieces of the commercial environment for space. There's lots of people making lots of money in commercial spaceflight. We're just not making lots of money yet in human commercial spaceflight, but that's going to come. And our group of speakers today will help us understand that. Today we have Carissa Christensen, who is Chief Executive Officer of Bryce Technology, Karina DeRees, the President of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, Roger Lanius, the Principal of Lanius Historical Services, and Phil McAllister, who's the NASA Director of Commercial Spaceflight. So, Carissa, if you'll turn on your camera and your audio, let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Alan. It is a pleasure to be here and to talk about one of my favorite topics, the commercial space economy and the ecosystem that enables and creates it. So I'm going to kick off our discussion today with, what a great panel, with an overview of the commercial space economy, what the pieces of it are and what the trends that we're seeing right now are, to provide some framing for the discussion that we're going to have today. So the commercial space economy is roughly, it's approaching $400 billion. And that's using a pretty strict definition of what a space company or what a space budget is. It includes companies and revenue that are using in-space assets. It does also include the totality of, for example, direct-to-home television revenue, because that's an integrated business model. So of that $400 billion, roughly a quarter, again, it's a little less than 400 billion, roughly a quarter is government budgets and 3/4 is revenue from companies. And I'm going to talk about what that revenue looks like and what those companies look like. So really, I think the most important place we can start is that there are two very distinct commercial ecosystems within the global space economy. One is the satellite value chain, and that drives the majority of the commercial revenue that we see today. The other is what I'll call in-space activities, and that is exploration, that is on-orbit R&D and manufacturing, that's platforms, that's the emergence of on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, separate from satellites. And that is very much of, and that's certainly a human spaceflight as well. That's certainly a big part of the conversation that we have about the potential for commercial space. And many of those markets are in an emergent stage. They're not mature, they're growing. And so that's the potential piece. So let me start with a little bit more on the satellite side. We've got essentially a fairly mature digital industry in space, and that is satellite services of various types. It's telecommunication services like television and direct radio and broadband to the end user, as well as satellite imagery. Also the satellite manufacturing that supports that, the ground segment that supports that, including a large number of GNSS, of navigation and timing applications, including 6+ billion chipsets in mobile phones to connect with satellite navigation systems. And also launch. And interestingly, the commercial launch market is around $5 or $6 billion. It's a relatively small dollar value of that commercial satellite market, but of course it's enabling. without launch, we would not have any space, commercial space activity. What's going on in that satellite segment that generates the majority of that revenue? There are two very large markets, direct-to-home television and GNSS products and services. Those are each about $100 billion. And then there are smaller value-added markets around broadband services to individuals, consumers, to airplanes, to cruise ships, and then satellite imagery, images of Earth, both the images and the analytics around those images. That is a growing segment of the satellite industry. And of course, we're seeing some really big changes in the satellite industry because of commercial investment, venture investment, and billionaire investment. As Alan mentioned, we've had some billionaires putting money into space, largely, though not entirely, into launch. And the combination of that investment plus smaller satellite form factors has enabled the emergence of startup companies, commercial companies that really operate in a different way. They look a lot more like typical venture companies in that they start small and they can grow. If you've got to launch a $200 million satellite, it's hard to start small. If you can start with some CubeSats or satellites that cost under $1 million each, you can incrementally grow a company. And that's been a very dynamic change for commercial space over the last, really since 2015 was really when the investment started flowing in a big way. And we're seeing the emergence of companies, the maturity of companies that were funded that way that have now gone public. We've had, I think now it's 10 companies announced that they're going to go public through special purpose acquisition corporations, as well as some other activity in that arena as well. Okay, so we've got a satellite industry that is fairly mature, that's going through changes, big satellites being augmented by small satellites, different market pressures as affecting that mature market, and then the emerging piece that drives the most revenue today. Let's talk about that in-space activity element. So that's a really relatively small part of revenue today. The revenue has come from things like commercial human spaceflight, of course, Virgin Galactic, which we saw conduct its launch, its first, its test launch this weekend with passengers, including folks known to many of us. My friend Sarisha Bandla, who was just amazing to see her do that, but still relatively early in the revenue cycle there. The non-satellite space activities include LEO R&D and manufacturing, and that's a very active area that NASA has supported and enabled. NASA and its ISS partners have supported and enabled, and I know we'll hear more from Phil McAllister, who's had a critical role in enabling those emerging markets like additive manufacturing, government and commercial astronauts, machine parts, thin film products, even sporting events, exotic fiber optic cables, bioprinted materials, non-terrestrial resources, and that's sort of in order of a probability or likelihood given the challenges to those markets. There's potential for future manufacturing. Also on the path to that potential for future manufacturing and to augment and enhance terrestrial manufacturing, there are a wide variety of R&D projects that are conducted on the space station and in space. And I'll mention a few just because I think they're really interesting. Delta Faucets has conducted ISS research on fluid dynamics. Hewlett Packard looking at supercomputing in harsh environments. Target conducted research on growing cotton. Any number of pharmaceutical companies have conducted a variety of research projects. Procter & Gamble has conducted research on the physics that associated with soaps and shampoos to improve shelf life. So there is a range of commercial activity enabled by government support and government programs with potential for expansion into standalone, a larger, more mature commercial market, depending on the factors driving each of those individual markets, the supply and demand considerations that are particularly, and those that are particularly sensitive to space are the cost of getting things to space and the cost of returning things from space. In addition, we're seeing growth in tourism, in on-orbit servicing and assembly, and in exploration, where commercial companies are playing new roles in supporting government exploration activities, and also even in some cases defining their own exploration agendas. So with that, I will pause and pass the conversation along to Karina Dries, and of course, Commercial Spaceflight Federation, which Karina leads, has been a critical player for this last decade of the development of new types of commercial space. And so, Karina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Carissa, and thank you to AAS for the kind invitation to speak today on this really important topic. Carissa actually provided great background for what's happening across the board in the commercial space industry. And what I'd like to do is just provide a little bit of background information on CSF and who we are, what we do, some of the companies that are involved, and some of the progress that we've seen within the industry since our founding, and kind of where we expect to see the industry to go in the foreseeable future. So just by way of background, Commercial Spaceflight Federation is the leading trade association for the commercial space industry. Really what we do is we focus on favorable policy to really secure US leadership in space by focusing on innovation, encouraging STEM, and getting more young people involved in the industry. In addition to promoting safe regulation for the industry through our partner FAA. So that's a little bit of background about CSF. Some of the companies or types of companies that are involved, it's really not about launch companies anymore as much as it was in our founding in 2006, where when we were called the Personal Spaceflight Federation. So at the time, it really was focused on strictly launch. And since then, as the industry has evolved, CSF has also evolved to include all companies working in the commercial world. So when we talk about commercial space, the difference between commercial space and traditional space really is, with commercial space companies, the government is a customer, and not necessarily the customer, but a customer, one of many customers. And as I talk a little bit about statistics, you'll kind of see with some of the things that Carissa just talked about with satellite companies, the reason that we're seeing a lot more activity today. Her talk also mentioned some in-space manufacturing. I gave a talk recently to a university that I titled The Expanse 2021 for folks that are sci-fi fans and watch the show The Expanse. This is what I see as sort of the beginning of that phase in human history, when we can figure out how to make things in space. This is only the beginning, and building a base on the moon is not that far-fetched anymore. It used to be crazy when people would say things like that. We're going to build a base on the moon. What are you talking about? But now that we have that capability of actually doing manufacturing in space, it's just not that far-fetched. So I think that's one of the more exciting things going on in the space industry. So in terms of launch, and you can't really talk about space without talking about launch, but there's a reason for this, and I'll touch on this when I talk about this data here. So we started tracking launch data in 2010. For that first 5-year period, so from 2010 to 2015, roughly 50% of the licensed launches were CSF member companies. That was largely commercial. But in the past 5 years, so 16 to 21, the number of launches has tripled, and the percentage of CSF member company launches has risen to 90%. So that increase in activity and increase in commercial activity is really significant. but it's really due to many factors, not only the additional demand by government, focus on commercial launch, but also such a significant portion that's due to the increased demand by commercial satellite companies, as Carissa mentioned. When the cost of manufacturing satellites came down, all of a sudden, all of these startup companies started popping up and building satellites. So I think that's a remarkable point, just to mention about 5 years ago when the industry really started focusing on those opportunities for startup companies. Some of the major milestones, really since commercial space got started or commercial space became a topic, the first one in my mind was sort of around 2001 when we saw the first space tourist. And then it was just kind of planted an idea in people's minds that maybe the average citizen can go to space. And I think this is what inspired a lot along the way. In 2004, we had the Spaceship One X Prize success. 2005, the ISS National Lab started up. 2012, we had the first commercial cargo to the International Space Station. 2013 is when CubeSats really started becoming much more common because they were much easier to manufacture. In 2014, we saw the first tool printed on the International Space Station, which I think is a really exciting moment when we start talking about manufacturing in space. 2016 was a real focus on reusability. 2018 was Spaceship Two's first flight to space, so the first commercial vehicle. And then we saw a bioprinter in 2019. So some of the commercial companies developing or doing research on the International Space Station is really significant. Another significant thing I think is the fact that companies are growing organs or trying to grow organs in a zero gravity environment. So that's another really exciting thing going on in space. And then to 2020, where we saw the first commercial crew. So this partnership that commercial industry developed with NASA was really critical in seeing that commercial crew program successful. And then another thing that Carissa touched on was the merger and acquisition activity and IPO activity. So we're starting to see a lot more of that, of companies that are going through acquisition process or through public offering because they see that opportunity. One thing that I get asked about from time to time is it really necessary to send people up into space to do the research and do experiments? And absolutely yes. And the reason is, as a scientist, you have much better results when you conduct your research in your ideal environment. So, we expect geologists to be able to conduct their research basically anywhere on Earth that's relevant to them. So same thing with a zero gravity environment. So the scientists that are conducting the research, it's better to have what we call a human-tended payload. So it's not just about the research activity that goes up into space and comes back down and then you do your analysis. It's much better for the scientist to be with the research at that time. So that's another kind of turning point. And one of the significant things I think happening today. So that's really kind of the overview that I wanted to provide, and I'm happy to answer questions. But one of the questions that we were asked when giving our talks is, what do we think the industry is going to need? And I mentioned the commercial crew program, commercial cargo program. This idea of a public-private partnership has, I think, paid dividends to the U.S. The idea that NASA is leaning a lot more on commercial, not only for NASA programs, but realizing that it's fueling this industry that's providing a lot more services to commercial, I think is really important to keep things going. So that was one of the things that I saw as critical to the U.S. space industry. So I will wrap up with that and just say thank you again to AAS for the opportunity. And I'd like to hand it over now to Roger. Roger, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My intention today is to talk a little bit about historical analogs for commercialization in space, drawing upon history to look at these things. And this is really predicated on a study I did a few years ago that if anybody wants to find it, it's available online at NASA. It's called Historical Analogs for the Stimulation of Space Commerce. And it's got 6 case studies in there, and some of them are ones that you might well understand very well. Others are less well known, but I'm only going to talk about 2 today. And the first one of those is one that everybody thinks about, and that is the issue of the 19th century railroads and the stimulation of activity to create railroads in the United States. Every local, state, and of course the federal government engaged in activities in the 19th century to extend the railroad networks. It was a part of a critical infrastructure. It was viewed as necessary to the development of the United States, to the expansion of settlement and movement to various places in the continental United States. And so that then led to a series of debates and test cases to see how best to try to do that. And they ran across the gamut of what you might expect, all the way from government ownership of some railroad systems. First one in South Carolina, for instance, was state-owned and operated and developed with dollars from that particular state in the 1830s. But the most famous, of course, is the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed the first line in 1869. And based upon what had gone before, the federal government, and this is this is sort of the money quote associated with the legislation, where Congress says we intend to do enough and only enough to induce capitalists to build the Pacific Railroad. And that's exactly what happened. They took a variety of forms. There was taxation issues that got addressed in this particular arena. There was land grants that were given to the companies that were building these roads so that they could use and develop those and sell them to others down the road. There were subsidy bonds, mortgages, if you will, for the railroads and the firms that provided funds to engage in this. And direct loans in some cases, both from states and territories and from the federal government to assist these entities in engaging in these activities. There were a series of non-monetary results that came to the federal government as a result of these activities. And you know, of course, that the railroad system became a critical piece of the infrastructure of the United States in the 19th century and remains so to this day. Less significant perhaps than it was in the 19th century, but nonetheless a very significant public-private partnership that very much changed the landscape of what happened in the United States. And that's a well-known story. NASA's been interested in this story since the 1960s, and in fact, in the mid-1960s, contracted with a group of historians to write a series of case studies about various railroads and how they came to be, with the intention of learning from that. And that book was published by MIT Press in the mid-1960s, called The Railroads and the Space Program. You learned a lot in reading that book about the railroads, not too much about the space program, but nonetheless, it's an important starting point and one that we can still draw lessons from. So what are the public-private partnerships that we've used today? And we've seen some of them. NASA's been very good at engaging in these since the beginning of the 21st century. And there's a whole variety of activities that I'm sure Phil can talk about in some detail about these particular actions and how it has changed the landscape of space activities as we move forward in the 21st century. The second case study that I want to talk about is one that's not very well known, and that has to do with the national park experience and tourism. So in 1916, Congress created the National Park Service. And its intended mission was to conserve natural and historical resources. And again, the money quote on this was, by such means as will leave them unimpaired. That's open to a lot of interpretation in terms of what unimpaired means. But the Park Service decided that they had a couple of different options. One of the things that they could do is to basically try to put up fences, keep people out, and keep these in a pristine form. And that was actually tried in some places for a little while without a whole lot of success. But the reality was that doesn't really enhance the public's understanding and use of these lands for valuable places for wildlife and so on. So the service decided to engage in infrastructure development that will enable people to go to the parks and to engage with the natural resources that were there in a way that was obviously not something that would be bad for the environment, but nonetheless would enhance people's lives. So the first thing they did was encourage the railroad companies through, again, a variety of mechanisms, land grants and other sorts of things, to extend railroad lines to places like Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon and a variety of other sites that you can think of that are now so much a part of our national park system. And then to induce concessionaires, hotels, restaurants, the people who provide those kinds of services, the companies that do that kind of work, to build facilities and provide infrastructure supporting tourism that would be of use to people who were engaged in that. Those concessionaires would also receive benefits from the process in terms of the contracts and what they could do there, but they also paid back fees to the Park Service, and a whole series of companies gained a capability that might not have ever been the case had there not been this activity. And it was quite significant. You can still go to some of these historic hotels, for instance, at the Grand Canyon, at Glacier Park and so forth, and see the sites that were created a century ago to enable tourists to go and to participate in this vacation tradition that's now so much of our lives. So those are just two examples of ways in which we have tried to stimulate commercial activities in terrestrial settings. Those can be extended into space in a whole variety of ways. NASA's been engaged in that previously. You know, outposts that might be developed from private sector activities on the moon, obviously space habitats and things of this nature. We're seeing this sort of thing happening today. And the private-public relationship is critical to this moving forward. And those partnerships can come in a variety of forms. They are only constrained by our ability to imagine how they might be structured. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it. We're already there today. As I said, I'm a historian. I am not about looking forward. I will defer to the other people on this panel about that. But this is an important, I think, baseline for us when we think about commercial development in space and what has gone before and how it might be applied in the future. With that, I am going to turn the podium, the virtual podium, if you will, over to Phil McAllister. Phil, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting an error message. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Alan, can you restart my video, please?
Working on it, Phil, just a moment.
Okay.
You should be good now. There you go. You're in dark, but we see you. Go ahead, Phil.
Dark.
Oh, there we are. Turned on the light.
Okay. Well, thanks. I appreciate it. The opportunity to talk to everybody today. I might start off on a little bit of a contrarian note. For those of you who know me, know that that's where I'm most comfortable. So I tend to vacillate sometimes between being very optimistic about where things are going and sometimes being a little less so. You'd think I'd be doing a victory lap this last weekend, which was just amazing. But I really kind of was thinking about this panel and the title of it being, a balance, finding a balance. And I thought that word was kind of curious. It reminded me of my days when I was an undergraduate at the University of Maryland. We had a pretty strong rivalry with Penn State in football at the time. And the interesting thing I thought was that we would consistently get creamed by Penn State. We never won for like 15 years. So I always thought the word rivalry was kind of interesting to use in that sense. And sometimes I get the same feeling when about this word balance with government and commercial. I really do feel like with all the gains that we've had in commercial space, which have been real and significant, the vast majority of activity in space is still dominated by the government sector, in my opinion. Notwithstanding Carissa's excellent statistics, if you sort of take out commercial communication satellites and the NGSS market, maybe a little bit of Earth sensing, Earth observations, still the vast majority of that really feels like it's dominated by the government. And I was pleased to hear about some of my colleagues talking about all the things that are going on, but I'm also kind of concerned about how many times NASA came up in that discussion. We really need other organizations, non-government organizations, to really be stepping up and doing more business-to-business activities. I think that's the real key going forward. I'm really proud of what NASA has been able to do in these public-private partnerships, and I feel like we have a lot more to do. But I think we really need to see the sort of business opportunities sort of independent of what's going to go on by NASA and for NASA, because we're still going to be predominantly driven by our mission requirements. If we can do that in a way that also helps the commercial sector, I think we're going to continue to look for those sort of opportunities, but we're still going to be primarily driven by our overall requirements. So I'm going to go to my glasses here. So I don't have charts, which I'm proud. Usually I have to break out in a rash when I hear we're not going to be able to use charts, because I do work at NASA, by the way. But I do have to look at my notes on occasion here. So I do feel like we've got a sort of a long way to go until we achieve sort of a quote unquote balance between commercial and government space. But on the optimistic note, I do feel like we are on the cusp of seeing that change, primarily because of three things. This may be driven by the fact that I'm here at NASA and I'm sort of very concerned about those things that we're doing. But the three things that I think that are occurring right now, sort of under our noses, that could really change things going forward is obviously commercial human spaceflight. After the space shuttle retired in 2011, we had no US human spaceflight missions for 10 years. And we just changed that last year when we did the SpaceX mission, the Demo 2 mission, and then we just certified the SpaceX system in November. So about 8 months ago, we actually had a certified commercial capability for human space transportation to orbit. And since that time, so we had that decade of period where no commercial launches, no government launches from US systems. And now we've got this commercial capability. And just within these last 8 months, since SpaceX has been certified, 4 commercial missions to orbit have already been announced. The Inspiration 4 mission, which is going to go in a couple months just to orbit, the Axiom private astronaut mission to the ISS early next year, and 2 Soyuz missions to the International Space Station, which would not have been enabled had we not had SpaceX flying, which relieves some of the demand for the Soyuz seats. So I think that's really kind of cool. And also the fact that we now have these suborbital capabilities that are about to come online soon. I read somewhere this morning that in the first 50 years of human spaceflight up to today, about 95% of the astronauts have been government employees. If you look forward to the next 50 years, it's likely that 95% of those people will be government employees. And when they go up there, they're not going to just want to be floating in space. That's going to get old pretty soon. They're going to want to do things in space. That's going to attract more people. More people are going to be wanting to do more things. And I really feel like we're going to see this synergistic sort of approach to the market, which will really allow this to take off. You know, we've always sort of wondered what's going to be the killer app in space. Well, I think we're looking at it. It's space tourism. Back when Carissa and I used to work together, geez, this was 20 years ago. Can you believe that, Carissa? I can't, when I just said that right now, it made me feel old, but we did a very, very comprehensive study on just about any market that anybody had been proposed in space. And we did a very sort of sober look at the potential growth opportunities of all those markets. I think there was over 25 or 30 markets. Space tourism was the one market that had significant growth potential. And I think we're now really seeing that that hopefully inflection point going forward. The second thing that I want to mention is the thing that we just released yesterday, which was announcements for proposals for commercial LEO destinations or commercial space stations. I think that's going to be the third leg in this stool in low Earth orbit. We've got commercial cargo capabilities now. If you want to send cargo to low Earth orbit, you can do that, do it commercially. Commercial crew, we've got that leg of the stool. And now hopefully soon we will have commercial destinations. And I think there will all three pieces of those infrastructures are necessary to be in commercial hands so that you can see sort of this synergistic relationship between those three and costs coming down. As long as NASA is the big player in LEO, either by managing the International Space Station or paying for most of the trips, I think we kind of warp the market. We're not as sensitive to cost as individuals and businesses are in the private sector. And so I think as long as NASA is the dominant player in LEO, we're going to continue to warp that market. But once we get out of destinations, those three legs of the stool will all be in the hands of the private sector. And I think we're going to see some very synergistic activity going on. And then lastly, what I would mention is sort of the trend within NASA towards fixed price contracting. I really feel like that's going to be huge. Throughout most of our development, it's almost been entirely cost plus contracting. You have a single prime provider, not very incentivized to lowering costs. You don't have a lot of competition. And if you think about it, every major contract that NASA HEO, the Human Exploration and Mission Directorate, has awarded since SLS and Orion has been fixed price. That's an amazing change. I think the one exception to that was the initial gateway contracts that we let, but we have now just converted that also to a fixed price contract. Fixed price contracting, I believe, is key to cost effectiveness. And that cost effectiveness is the thing that I think is going to be the key to commercial space really taking off, no pun intended. So I'm really kind of encouraged by those three things, but I don't want us to sort of get caught up in the hype and think commercial space is here. We've still got a lot of work to do, and I feel like commercial space has got a long way to go before we get into any kind of real balance with the government sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Now I'd like to ask all the panelists to turn on the cameras and their microphones. And we're just going to take a moment for a rejoiner or retribution or response for 1 minute or less. Comments on what you've heard from others. Carissa?
So to kind of jump off on Phil's points, which are exactly right. We are comparing, one of the reasons I highlighted the mature satellite industry, which is generates quite a lot of revenue, hundreds of billions of dollars, to the in-space ecosystem is because of the stark contrast between that focus on commercial versus focused on government as a customer today. And that path to maturity, we're starting to see milestones on commercial human spaceflight, for example. And we've seen both successes and some very visible failures in that path to commercial development. And that's, as Karina talked about, one of CSF's reasons for existing is to try to facilitate that pathway through a variety of mechanisms. I think it's really important as we look toward the future to recognize that failure is part of commercial success. I often quote this statistic. A Harvard Business School professor published an analysis that said, looking at all venture funded firms, so venture capital, which is driving massive firms like Google and Uber, and looking at all venture funded firms, 3 out of 4 of them fail. And then anecdotally, 1 out of 10 of them really drive all the returns for venture investors. And so it will not be a straight pathway, we will see ups and downs. And certainly I think there are some markets we would all like to see succeed that may not, and others that may surprise us. So in terms of in-space activity, we're still seeking that balance. And on the satellite side, boy, is that changing in an exciting way.
Thank you, Carissa. Karina, in your response.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple of things that I wanted to pick up on. Yeah, I definitely think that the demand, the commercial sector demand, is driving a lot of the activity, which is something that was touched on by a lot of the folks in the panel. The government involvement in infrastructure, I think, is also critical when we think about how other transportation infrastructure has evolved over the past, century. It's largely due to government involvement initially. So that's something that I think is going to need another hard look going forward as we think about, just securing America's position in space. Infrastructure is a really key component to that. Regarding the space tourism, I have a couple of, personal opinions about it. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for just the average citizen to have that possibility to go into space. And you always hear from folks that have had that opportunity that have said it's life-changing. You just don't really understand the perspective unless you experience it yourself. And I suppose that's kind of similar to, folks before they have children and after they have children, when people tell them, your life will never be the same once you have children, and you can't imagine what your life would be like without them. So I think there's some comparison there. But another thing that gets me excited about what some of these companies are doing with their vehicle development is the idea of being able to travel on the Earth at a much faster pace. So the point-to-point transportation, which I think is also an exciting aspect of what the industry is working on. It's not, for the companies that are developing vehicles for space tourism, that's really just one component for some of the companies to be able to take passengers up and back into space. But the longer term objective with some of these vehicles is to be able to travel from point A to point B on the Earth in a fraction of the time, which is also really important, not only for human transportation and just to get that kind of additional exposure to what's happening on the Earth and other civilizations, like commercial airline travel has done for humanity over the generations. But the idea of being able to transport, time critical things around the Earth, I think, is going to be another essential component to the industry down the road. We've got some time, but that's another thing that I get excited about with the industry.
Roger.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think are significant. Space tourism gets a lot of attention, and just the last weekend we had the excitement associated with Branson and the flight, and of course we're going to see more of that later this summer. The question is, what's the sustainability of that? I think over the long haul, I don't know that we know the answer to that. I know there's been studies that have been done, but at the very least, it's adventure tourism. And so how many times are people going to fly on these up and down flights? And what's your market base that can do that? There's probably people on this panel who know the answer to that, but I'm not one of them. But I think most people, when they think of space tourism, are really thinking about orbital activities or, taking a honeymoon on the moon or something like that. And so my question whenever that comes up is, what are the assumptions people are making when they say the words space tourism? What does that mean? Beyond that, I am fascinated by the amount of commercial activities that we don't think of that are space-based in some form or another. And everybody's touched on that at some level. We all think of the launch providers. We all think of the satellite companies and various things like that, but we don't necessarily think of the Garmin company, for instance, most of the time, although they are a firm that I would contend is very much a space company, and they wouldn't have a business without it. But with those kinds of issues, I would like to know more about public perceptions and how they are driving activities and especially investment in space commerce. And I'll leave it at that.
All right, Phil.
Yeah, I thought Carissa brought up a really good point about the level of investment and venture capital that's coming into our industry. I kind of worry about that too. The worry is I've sort of been through a couple of these cycles, right? And I'm sure all of us on the panel probably have seen these, where we have gone through these periods where money does flow into the space industry, and there's a lot of exuberance right now. There's a lot of questionable valuations that are happening. I think it's all fine, but I am a little worried. We are going to see some failures. It's unquestionably going to be the case, and I'm a little bit worried that the pendulum sort of swings back the other way, and we go through this really dry period. Hopefully, we will be able to sustain some of those failures and continue on, and still see the good businesses continue to get investment. That's another sort of worry that I have out there. And particularly with the tourism market, you know, we are going to see some failures. There are fatalities in every mode of human transportation. Even bicycles, a couple hundred people die on bikes every year, and that's not a very energetic mode of transportation, certainly not compared to space transportation. So when we have these failures, both business and technical, we're going to have to be able to weather that storm and come out the other side, hopefully stronger, with better business plans, better technical plans, better everything. But hopefully the spigot doesn't dry up completely and we go through these boom and bust cycles that we've seen in the past couple decades.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks for all the panel for both their initial comments and their rejoinders, which were actually pretty well thought out. Now, I've got a couple of things to return to look at and to ask you guys. Phil talked about the NASA or the government being the primary driver of the economy right now. And we're not going to go off and debate whether that is true or not. But I want to ask Roger, he was talking about the railroads and about the park services and some of the other allegories we could look at. How much of the support, or how much of the success was due to the government supporting development of the transportation system, as opposed to the government supporting things to do with the transportation system? I think some of Phil's comments were based upon, we got to have other things to do in space other than what the government wants to do. We got to have commercial folks wanting to do things in space. Roger, how much of what was done in the past helped us get things to do that the transportation system's enabled?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, everybody, the railroads are a great example. Everybody recognized that there was a purpose for these things. It wasn't just to support some government activity, and you know, moving goods from one location to another, moving people from one location to another. I mean, that's fundamental infrastructure. If you don't do it on railroads, you've got to do it in a different way. And the government, local, state, and federal, had a long history of engaging in this. They built the National Road in the latter part of the 18th century into the first part of the 19th century. The state of New York built the Erie Canal in the early part of the 19th century for these purposes. And they recognized that there was a real reason to do it that was not just for the benefit of the government, but for the benefit of a larger commercial set of activities that were both private and public. No question about that. You can use the canal, you can use the National Road for the transportation of governmental entities, military, whatever it happened to be, or for the transportation of goods and services. Well, goods really, and so there's an obvious sense that there is a market, or there wouldn't have been much investment to start with. We've had a little bit of that as a difficulty when it comes to space activities, because so much of the activity historically has been for the benefit of the government. There are some notable exceptions to that, and everybody can point to the satellite communications industry as an example of something different. But until we have those key commercial activities that everybody recognizes are something we want to do, we're probably not going to get, and I'm really thinking of someplace like the moon, we're probably not going to get the infrastructure investment necessary from a private sector activity to try to make that happen at all, even with a public partnership to do it. Anyway, that's my take on it. Everybody else, you probably have some other ideas.
Okay, Karina, a little different direction. We've talked as though the U.S. development is of this market and its capabilities and transportation and things to do. We've talked as though it's kind of in a bubble. International folks have a lot of things they're doing. They occupy a lot of the market, or they want to take a lot of the market. What are your members concerned about with the development of capabilities and market aggression? I guess in commercial space, there's aggression out of the international players.
That's a great question. And quite frankly, that's always a topic that CSF is concerned about. When we look at things like favorable policy for the US commercial space industry, it's not just what are we worried about today, or not worried about, that's not necessarily the right word, but what are some of our priorities today? But also, how do we try to predict what could happen, 10 years down the road? And when we look at those types of priorities, the long-term priorities, that plays a significant factor in how we determine how to set those priorities for the industry from a policy and regulatory perspective. So it is becoming a lot more significant when you look at the potential end of life for the International Space Station, with other countries that are launching their own space habitats, that countries don't necessarily play by the same rules when it comes to space traffic management. And right now, there's really not a lot of leadership there. So it absolutely plays a pretty significant role. The other issue that keeps coming up, and one of the reasons that we advocate for favorable policy within the US, is satellite companies don't have to launch from the US necessarily. If they're launching a private satellite for a private company, they can go anywhere. So having that capability in the US for commercial purposes also creates that capability for government purposes. So that launch capability doesn't necessarily need to be just for commercial purposes. And companies have those options to go elsewhere. So I think, there's a reason that space programs are relatively siloed. And I think that NASA really sees the US capability from a civil perspective needs to include commercial for that reason, not only for the commercial capability, but for government capability as well.
All right, thank you, Karina. That was well thought out on the spur of the moment. So thanks a lot. I point out to our audience, these questions have not been pre-screened to the speakers. These are kind of rough. Phil, going along with something that Karina just said, and she said with the end of ISS, your procurement has pretty strongly proclaimed that we're going to move our development and research off the ISS beginning in 2028 and completing in 2030. What do you see as that affecting as far as the supply chain for developing this volume of research? Do you see that the commercial stations, the commercial destinations are going to be able to handle that volume of of research and activity? What do you think we're going to have a step function down?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that. In terms of the supply chain, I think it will be beneficial again because you'll have these business-to-business arrangements. There's going to be a lot of pressure on costs, and so I think that will be good. In terms of the amount of research volume, I do expect it to go down. The International Space Station, it's large. I mean, it's the size of a football field. It has a lot of internal volume, a lot of racks. It can support, right now, 7 people can probably do up to 10 or 11 for short durations. That's probably more than, it's certainly more than NASA will need in the latter part of this decade. And I think it will probably be more than what will be initially needed, even for non-government markets. So probably one of the ways that the private industry is going to deal with this is by having modular space stations where they can sort of build out as the market matures and as demand increases. That's a very attractive model, right? You don't have to pay for a lot of infrastructure unless you're actually using it. So I would think a modular sort of build it as demand materializes approach might be beneficial going forward. But if somebody's really bullish on it and they put out a station that has a lot of capacity, I think that's good too, because then that puts pressure on their salespeople to go out and fill it up. So there could be benefits either way.
Thanks, Phil. Carissa, you mentioned SPACs. I'm not a big finance guy. I did a little business development in my life, but I'm not a big finance guy or a big corporate management guy. But to the layman, SPACs look like holding companies that are funded by a handful of really rich guys. Is there a real difference between holding companies and SPACs?
Basically, a SPAC is certainly an investment vehicle. So investors put money in, and those companies are created in order to buy other companies, to acquire other companies, and take them public. And I'm being a little imprecise, but the end state is that company that gets acquired becomes a publicly traded company. And so it's extremely interesting for us in the commercial space community, because this moves companies that are venture funded from being privately held, meaning we don't necessarily have insight into their revenues, we don't have insight into their performance, into being publicly traded at a very early stage compared to when companies might often become publicly traded. So we'll have a metric to track their performance as they move through their growth cycle. We'll see their stock price. I think 3 of the companies, of the 10 or so companies that have announced SPACs, are currently trading. Because it takes a while to go through that process. So within the next year, we'll have, I would estimate, a dozen space companies in various arenas where we can actually see their performance in a very clear way because of the reporting requirements for publicly traded companies. It will be a very different phase of the emergence and growth of new commercial companies.
That will certainly eliminate some of the mystery and the liar's poker. I'm sorry to be uncivil about it, but the liar's poker that you get in sometimes with developing industries.
I think it will be very interesting because it changes the stakeholder community. There are reporters, there are investment banks, there are analysts that will, part of their job is to have an opinion on companies that are publicly traded. And so it really will change the community that is focusing on these companies.
Yeah, excellent. One more question, and this is kind of in response to the launch we just had and the one that's coming up. And we've talked about, I think everybody's talked about space tourism and perhaps a huge space tourism market. So this is from Sairaj. Is there any reason to be concerned that space tourism can also destroy Earth's protective ozone layer, since these spacecrafts go to the 50 to 100 kilometer altitudes? You'll get a concentration of activity there. And I don't expect that you guys follow this directly, but I think maybe Phil has the best visibility as to what may be happening across the different industries for this. So I'll throw it at Phil.
Oh, geez, Alan, I was hoping you wouldn't call my name. That one's not an area that I've been tracking. In terms of the suborbital spacecraft, Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, the really cool thing about both of them is that they were entirely funded by the private sector. So my visibility into those companies is relatively limited. Very excited about them, but I don't think I'd be able to comment on the technical aspects of their emissions.
Okay, let me broaden the question a little bit. I think Carissa wants to jump in. You see her moving forward towards her camera. I want to talk. The concern is if we have a tremendous amount of new activity in the 50 to 100 kilometer level, is there an environmental impact that we need to worry about before we allow it to happen?
I think there are a few notes. One, and I can't offer any independent engineering assessment of this, but I will comment that Blue Origin has specifically talked about their minimal impact on the ozone layer. Two, technology advancement can change impact. Three, and I think perhaps the most important, this is a matter of scale. So at the scale that we'll see in the foreseeable future compared to, for example, the scale associated with airline travel, the impact is likely to be relatively minimal. At a significantly increased scale, I would certainly anticipate that we will see some evolution of technology and government regulatory roles to manage that impact. It's an interesting question.
All right, anybody else want to jump in on that before we close out?
Yeah, just real quick, collectively commercial, or not commercial, but space launch attributes to less than 1% of, that environmental impact. So while it's not zero, certainly, and I think, you've got a lot of folks within these companies that are motivated to enhance those propulsion systems, it is definitely not significant in terms of the other environmental impacts to the ozone layer, just for what that's worth.
All right, good, thank you. Significance is important. Being proportional in your responses is important. So Phil, Carissa, Roger, Karina, thank you very much for a tremendous panel. Never anticipated it was going to be done so well and done so easily. Me not having to do very much work. So thank you all very much. I would once again want to thank our day one sponsors, and that is the Aerospace Corporation and Dynetics. And now we'll take a break until 1:25 Eastern, when we'll hear from our first award winner for the Molly McCauley Awards. Thank you very much. We'll see you at 1:25.
Thank you.